At 14,000 feet over Rabaul Harbor on November 7, 1943, aviation machinist mate first class Richard Parker wrapped his hands around the twin .50 caliber machine gun grips, watching a Japanese Zero dive toward his Corsair from the same angle that had killed 3 rear gunners in his squadron during the past 6 weeks. Parker was 24 years old. He had spent 8 months as a rear gunner. He had survived 17 combat engagements, and he had 0 confirmed kills. That morning, the Japanese had launched 32 Zeros to intercept an American bomber formation approaching Rabaul. The first rear gunner Parker replaced had been aviation machinist's mate second class David Martinez, September 14, 1943. Martinez followed the manual perfectly. He aimed directly at attacking Zeros and led them by half a wingspan, exactly as taught at Pensacola. His tracers passed behind every time. A Zero came from the 9 o'clock position at level altitude. Martinez fired 4 bursts using deflection technique. All 4 missed. The Zero's 20mm cannon rounds punched through the Corsair's fuel tank. Martinez died in the explosion before his pilot could even call for help. The second gunner Parker replaced was aviation machinist's mate third class Tommy Wilson. Wilson tried modifying the technique on his own. Instead of leading targets by half a wingspan, he led them by 2 full wings. Still couldn't connect. He watched his tracers arc into empty sky behind every Zero that attacked. When a Zero made a head-on pass, Wilson fired desperately. The Zero pilot knew Wilson couldn't hit him. He pressed the attack to 200 yards. Cannon fire shredded the Corsair's engine. Wilson's aircraft went down trailing smoke. They never found his body. The third gunner Parker replaced was aviation machinist mate second class James Cole. October 27, same story, puppet technique, perfect form, 0 kills. Then a Zero he couldn't hit killed him. By early November, Parker's squadron had lost 8 rear gunners in 6 weeks. The deflection shooting method taught at Pensacola wasn't working. Every gunner knew it. Every gunner kept using it anyway, because there was no alternative. Now a Zero was diving toward Parker from 11 o'clock high.
300 yards out, closing at more than 400 miles per hour combined speed.
Parker's training said aim directly at the target. Lead it slightly. Squeeze the trigger when the aircraft fills the sight picture. Standard deflection shooting, what every Navy gunner learned. Parker ignored everything he had been taught. He aimed 8 aircraft lengths ahead of the Zero, not at the Zero, not slightly ahead. 8 full aircraft lengths into empty sky where nothing existed except air, and Parker's certainty that this was the only way to survive the next 10 seconds. Lieutenant James Morrison was pulling the Corsair into a hard left bank. G-forces pushed Parker deep into his seat. His arms felt like weighed 40 pounds each. The gun sight vibrated against his eye. The Zero moved across his field of vision at a speed that made accurate shooting impossible by every standard in the manual. Parker squeezed both triggers. The twin .50s hammered, 500 rounds per minute combined. The noise was deafening even through his leather helmet. Hot brass casings ejected past his face.
Smell of cordite filled the cramped gunner's position.
Tracers arced out ahead of the Corsair in a stream that looked like it would miss by a country mile. The Zero flew directly into Parker's bullet stream, not where Parker had aimed, where the bullets would be seconds later when the Zero reached that point in space. Metal tore through the Zero's engine cowling. The propeller shattered. Black smoke erupted. The Zero rolled inverted and spiraled toward the ocean 4 miles below. Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom. What the hell kind of shooting was that? Parker didn't answer immediately. Hands were shaking, not from fear. From the realization that he had just done something that contradicted every hour of gunnery training he had ever received. He had aimed at a point where the target wasn't, where the target would be, and it had worked. The Corsair continued its patrol over Rabaul. The Japanese airbase below was heavily defended. American bombers were striking the harbor and airfields. Parker's squadron provided fighter cover, which meant more Zeros were coming, and Parker would have to decide whether to trust his training or trust what he had just discovered. 3 minutes later, 2 more Zeros appeared at the 10 o'clock position. Morrison spotted them first. Parker rotated his gun position. Standard Navy procedure said to lead targets by half a wingspan for every 100 knots of crossing speed. Simple formula, easy to remember. Completely useless when the target was maneuvering and the shooting platform was also turning. Parker made a calculation that wasn't in any manual. The Zeros were closing at roughly 200 knots combined speed. His bullets would take about 1 second to reach engagement range. That meant he needed to aim 10 aircraft lengths ahead, not half a wingspan, 10 full aircraft lengths. He aimed into empty blue sky again, then squeezed the triggers. The .50s roared. Tracers reached out. The lead Zero flew through the bullet stream exactly where Parker had predicted. The cockpit canopy shattered. The Zero nose down, trailing smoke. The second Zero broke hard right and disappeared into cloud cover. Morrison's voice came over the intercom again. This time there was no question in his tone. "You're not aiming at them." "No, sir," Parker said. "I'm aiming at where they're going to be. That's not what they taught us at Pensacola." "I know, sir." Morrison was silent for 5 seconds. Then he said something Parker would remember for the rest of his life. "Keep doing it. The patrol lasted another 40 minutes, Parker got 3 more firing opportunities. He used his new method each time, aiming far ahead. Leading the target by what felt like an impossible distance, 2 more Zeros went down, 1 broke off smoking when Morrison finally brought the Corsair back to the carrier. The aircraft had bullet holes in the tail and scorch marks along the fuselage. But Parker had done something no gunner in the squadron had managed in months. He had shot down multiple Zeros in a single mission. Without realizing it, Parker had just rewritten the rules of aerial gunnery, and the rest of the war would prove it. But Parker still didn't understand why it worked. He only knew one thing. For the first time since arriving in the Pacific, the enemy fighters weren't untouchable anymore. What Parker didn't understand yet was why his method worked. He only knew that for the first time since arriving in the Pacific, the bullets from his guns had met the enemy exactly where they needed to be.
Shooting had been killing American aircrew since the very beginning of the war. The official Navy gunnery manual issued in 1942 dedicated 12 pages to the theory. There were diagrams showing lead angles, tables calculating sight pictures based on target speed and crossing angle, mathematical formulas that worked perfectly on paper and failed catastrophically in combat. The fundamental problem was speed. A Japanese Zero could turn tighter and maneuver faster than almost any American aircraft operating in the Pacific theater. Maximum speed around 330 miles per hour. A turn radius that allowed it to reverse direction in under 4 seconds. When a Zero pilot wanted to evade gunfire, he didn't fly straight. He pulled hard turns, he climbed, he dove, he changed direction constantly, which meant the deflection calculations in the Navy manual became useless the moment real combat started. American gunners were trained on a system developed before the war, static targets, flight paths. The assumption that enemy aircraft would fly relatively straight during engagement, that assumption killed men. Between December 1941 and October 1943, American forces in the Pacific had lost more than 800 aircraft to Japanese fighters. Many of those losses happened because American gunners simply couldn't hit maneuvering targets. The standard method taught at every naval air station was simple. Estimate the target speed, estimate the crossing angle. Use a mental calculation to determine lead distance. Aim ahead of the target, fight A. In theory, the bullets in the aircraft would meet at the same point in space. In practice, by the time the bullets arrived, the Zero had already changed direction. The problem was worse for rear gunners like Parker. They were shooting from a moving platform that was also maneuvering. The pilot was turning, the target was turning. The gunner had to calculate both movements simultaneously while being thrown around by G-forces, dealing with vibration that made precise aiming nearly impossible. The Navy's answer was simple: more training, more practice, more discipline. None of it addressed the core issue. Ammunition was another problem. The Corsair's rear gun position carried about 1,500 rounds for both machine guns. That sounded like a lot, until you calculated firing time. At roughly 500 rounds per minute combined, that meant only about 3 minutes of continuous fire, but no gunner fired continuously. They fired short bursts, 2 seconds at most. Each burst used around 16 rounds, which meant a Corsair gunner had maybe 90 bursts available for an entire mission. Combat patrols over Rabaul could last 2 hours, multiple engagements, multiple attackers. Every burst had to count, but when the deflection method didn't work, making bursts count became impossible. Japanese pilots knew about the weakness. Zero pilots were trained to exploit it. The tactic was simple. When an American gun open fire, brake hard in any direction. The American would aim where you were. By the time the bullets arrived, you would be somewhere else. Then reverse and attack again from a different angle. American gunners called it the Zero Dance, a series of unpredictable turns that made traditional deflection shooting useless. The statistics from the first year of the Pacific War were brutal. American rear gunners scored confirmed kills in only about 6% of firing opportunities. That meant 94% of the time the ammunition was wasted, the Zero escaped, and the bomber or fighter remained vulnerable. Squadron commanders knew the numbers. They knew the doctrine wasn't working, but there was no alternative. The Navy had spent years developing the system. It was backed by mathematics testing, experts at Pensacola who had never been shot at by a Japanese fighter. Parker had been flying combat missions for 8 months. He had fired at enemy aircraft 17 times. November 7th, he had never scored a confirmed kill, not because he was a poor shot, because he was following the manual, watching tracers pass behind every target, watching Zeros twist away from his fire. The worst part wasn't the failure. It was the feeling that the system itself was broken. Parker had experienced that frustration firsthand months earlier. On his 4th combat mission in July 1943, a Zero made a stern attack on his Corsair. Parker fired 3 bursts using proper deflection technique. All 3 missed. The Zero's cannon rounds punched holes through the Corsair's left wing. Fuel leaked from the tank.
Lieutenant Morrison somehow managed to nurse the aircraft back to the carrier on fumes. After they landed, Morrison didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Parker knew he had failed. That memory stayed with him. Every mission afterward, he followed the manual perfectly and missed every time. But on November 7, something changed. Parker stopped following the manual. Instead, he aimed at a point that felt wrong, looked wrong, contradicted everything he had learned, and the Zero flew directly into his bullets. What made this even stranger was that Parker couldn't fully explain why he had done it. He hadn't calculated it consciously. He hadn't studied the physics. He had simply reacted. As if months of watching tracers miss had trained his brain to predict where the target would actually be. 3 days after the Rabaul mission, Parker had a chance to test the method again. November 10th, 1943. Bomber escort over Bougainville. 12 Corsairs protecting a formation of B-24 Liberators heading toward Japanese supply dumps. Before takeoff, Morrison pulled Parker aside. "If we see zeros," he said quietly, "use whatever you did last." I nodded, but inside his stomach twisted with doubt. What if it had just been luck? What if the Zero had flown into the bullets by accident? The formation reached the target area shortly after 9 in the morning. The B-24s began their bombing run. Anti-aircraft fire burst across the sky, black clouds of shrapnel exploding at bomber altitude. Then Morrison's voice came over the intercom. "Forceros, 2 o'clock high, coming fast." Parker swung the guns around. The Zeros were diving steeply from 15,000 feet, high-speed attack, the kind that gave a gunner maybe 5 seconds to react. His training told him to wait until the enemy was closer, get a better sight picture, calculate the deflection carefully. Instead, Parker aimed 12 aircraft lengths ahead of the lead Zero. He didn't calculate, he estimated. Where would that aircraft be in 1 second? Where would it be when the bullets arrived? He squeezed the triggers. The top 50 caliber guns roared. The recoil slammed against his shoulders. Tracers streaked into empty sky ahead of the diving fighter. For a moment it looked ridiculous, like he was firing at nothing. Then the Zero flew directly through the stream of bullets. The canopy exploded. The aircraft pitched downward, smoke pouring from the engine. Parker shifted his aim to the second Zero. This one was turning while diving. He aimed even farther ahead. Fired again. The fighter's left wing tore away from the fuselage. The aircraft tumbled out of control. Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom. "You just got 2 in under 10 seconds. Parker didn't answer. He was breathing hard. His hands locked around the gun grips. Sweat ran down his face inside the leather helmet. The smell of gunpowder burned in his throat, but he had done it again. Not by accident, deliberately. The remaining Zeros broke off their attack. Parker glanced at the ammunition counter. 200 rounds used. Still plenty left. But more important than ammunition was the realization forming in his mind. This wasn't luck. It was a method, one that worked far better than anything in the manual. By the time Parker's Corsair returned to the carrier deck that afternoon, the news had already started spreading through the squadron. Rear gunners talked, they always had, in the ready room, on the flight deck during maintenance, in the mess hall while eating cold eggs and powdered coffee. And what they were talking about now was impossible to ignore. Richard Parker had just shot down 2 Zeros in under 10 seconds. For a squadron that had struggled for months just to land a single hit, that was something close to unbelievable. When Parker climbed down from the aircraft, several other gunners were already waiting. One of them was Aviation Machinist's mate, second-class Tommy Chen. Chen had been in the Pacific for 6 months. In that time, he had fired at Japanese fighters more than 20 times. He had 0 kills. "All right," Chen said, folding his arms. "What are you doing differently?" Parker hesitated, because what he was about to say sounded ridiculous. "I'm not aiming at them," he finally said. Chen frowned. "What do you mean?" "I'm aiming where they're going to be." The other gunners exchanged skeptical looks. Chen shook his head. "That's just deflection shooting." "No," Parker said quietly. "It's not." He picked up a grease pencil from the workbench and drew 2 small shapes on a scrap of cardboard. "This is the Zero," he said, tapping the first mark. Then he drew another point far ahead of it. "And this is where it will be when the bullets arrive." The distance between the 2 points looked absurd. Chen stared at the drawing. "You're leading it by that much, sometimes more." "That's insane. That's why it works," Parker replied. Chen didn't look convinced. But he didn't laugh either, because the scoreboard didn't lie. 2 Zeros destroyed in 1 engagement. That kind of result demanded attention. Later that night, Parker and Chen walked up to the flight deck. The carrier lights were dim. Maintenance crews moved quietly around parked aircraft. The ocean stretched black and endless beyond the deck. Parker stood near one of the Corsairs and used his hand to demonstrate. "Imagine the Zero here," he said. Chen nodded. "Your bullets take about a second to reach him." Chen nodded again. "In 1 second, a Zero flying 300 miles per hour moves more than 200 feet. Parker stretched his arms wide across the deck. "So you aim here." Chen stared at the empty space Parker indicated. "That's not aiming," he said. "That's guessing." "Not guessing," Parker replied. "Predicting." Chen rubbed the back of his neck. "You really think it'll work for me?" Parker shrugged. "Only one way to find out." Chen's next combat mission came 2 days later, November 13, 1943. Another bomber escort over Rabaul. Another swarm of Japanese fighters rising to intercept the formation. When the first Zero dove toward Chen's aircraft, every instinct in his body told him to aim directly at the target. That was how he had been trained, that was what the manual said. Instead, he forced himself to do what Parker had shown. He aimed far ahead at empty, then fired. The tracer streaked forward. For a split second, it looked completely wrong. Then the Zero flew directly into the stream of bullets. The cockpit shattered. The aircraft rolled sideways, trailing smoke. Chen stared in disbelief. When he landed back on the carrier, he found Parker in the ready room. Chen walked straight up to him and said 3 words. "It actually works." That was the moment the technique started spreading, not through official channels, through gunners. Word moved quickly between men who depended on each other to stay alive. Within 2 weeks, 6 different gunners in Parker's squadron had begun experimenting with the extreme lead method. At first, the results were inconsistent. Some gunners aimed too far ahead, others not far enough. But as they practiced, their accuracy improved dramatically. The statistics told the story better than any explanation could. In October 1943, Parker's squadron had scored 9 confirmed kills against Japanese fighters. In December,
After the new technique spread among the gunners, they scored
41, more than 4 times the previous total. Squadron leadership noticed immediately. The commanding officer called Parker into his office. He sat behind a metal desk covered with combat reports. "I'm hearing rumors," the commander said, "about you teaching some kind of unofficial shooting method." Parker nodded. "Yes, sir." The commander leaned back in his chair. "You realize that contradicts Navy doctrine?" "Yes, sir." "And you're teaching it anyway?" Parker hesitated, then answered honestly, "Yes, sir." The commander studied him for a moment. Then he picked up one of the combat reports. 41 kills this month, he said quietly. He set the report down again. "Keep doing it." Parker blinked. "Sir, just don't put anything in writing." That was how the method spread across the Pacific. Quietly, unofficially, carrier groups rotated between ships. Squadrons met each other during refueling stops and ports. Gunners talked. One gunner would explain the technique to another. That gunner would try it in combat. If it worked, he would teach it to his squadron. The process repeated itself again and again. By early 1944, the technique had spread to at least 15 squadrons. Some called it extreme lead shooting. Others called it future point aiming. Among the gunners who had learned it directly from Parker, it had a simpler name. The Parker method. Not everyone accepted it immediately. Aviation machinist made first class Robert Hayes refused to believe the Navy's official training could be wrong. He argued with Parker for nearly 20 minutes in the ready room. "The Navy wouldn't teach us something that doesn't work," Hayes insisted. Parker didn't argue. He simply handed Hayes the combat statistics. 6% hit rate with the old method, nearly 60% with the new one. Hayes stared at the numbers. 2 days later, he tried it during an engagement over the Solomon Islands. He shot down 2 Zeros in a single fight. After that, he stopped arguing. By March 1944, the technique had spread across 4 different carriers. Hundreds of gunners were using it, but officially it didn't exist. The Navy manual still taught the old system. The diagram still showed small lead angles. The training film still demonstrated traditional deflection shooting. In combat, the gunners ignored it. They aimed where the enemy aircraft would be, and the enemy fighters started falling out of the sky. Japanese pilots began noticing something strange. 6 months earlier, American rear gunners had been easy to evade. Brake hard left, pull up, dive away. The tracers would pass harmlessly behind. Now the bullets appeared far ahead of them, in places where no gunner should logically be aiming, and somehow the Zeros kept flying straight into them. Japanese intelligence officers studying combat reports came to an unexpected conclusion. They believed the Americans had developed advanced predictive gun sights, some kind of mechanical computer that automatically calculated where a moving aircraft would be in the future. It sounded logical. After all, how else could a gunner know exactly where to aim? The truth was far simpler. There was no computer, no advanced technology, just a mechanic from Sacramento who had spent months watching bullets miss until he realized where they actually needed to go. And once that idea spread, the balance of air combat in the Pacific began to shift. By the spring of 1944, something unusual had begun appearing in Japanese combat reports. Pilots returning from engagements with American aircraft were describing gunfire that made no sense. Tracers were appearing in empty sky far ahead of their aircraft, places where no gunner should logically be aiming, and yet somehow the Japanese fighters kept flying directly into those streams of bullets. At first, Japanese commanders assumed their pilots were exaggerating. Combat reports were often unreliable. Pilots under stress sometimes misjudged distances or angles. But the reports kept coming from different squadrons from different parts of the Pacific, and they all described the same phenomenon. American gunners were suddenly hitting maneuvering fighters with a level of accuracy that had never been seen before. Imperial Japanese Navy aviation intelligence began investigating. Their analysts studied dozens of combat reports. They interviewed pilots. They examined wreckage from aircraft that had managed to limp back to base. Eventually, they reached a conclusion. The Americans must have developed some kind of predictive gun sight technology, perhaps a mechanical system installed near the gun mount, maybe a device capable of calculating future aircraft positions based on speed and trajectory. To Japanese intelligence officers, this explanation made perfect sense. After all, modern warfare was becoming increasingly technological. Hadar. Advanced navigation systems, aircraft instrumentation, why not a computer-assisted gun sight? The possibility that American gunners were simply aiming farther ahead never occurred to them. It seemed too crude, too simple. Surely something that effective must involve advanced engineering. This misunderstanding created an unexpected advantage for American forces, because the Japanese began developing countermeasures against a technology that didn't actually exist. One of the first changes they introduced was increased maneuver unpredictability. Pilots were instructed to change direction constantly during attacks, turn sharply, climb suddenly, dive without warning. The theory was simple. If American gunners were relying on predictive calculations, unpredictable movement would disrupt the calculations. The targeting systems would become confused. The shots would miss. In practice, the results were the opposite. Random maneuvering often made the fighters easier to hit because physics limited how quickly an aircraft could change direction. When a Zero pilot began a sharp turn, the aircraft had to remain in that turn for at least a full second before reversing course. That moment of commitment created a predictable arc, and gunners using Parker's method could see the maneuver begin. They aimed not where the aircraft was, but where it would be mid-turn. The more aggressively the Japanese fighters maneuvered, the more predictable those arcs became. Another tactic involved higher speed attacks. Japanese commanders believed faster passes would give American gunners less time to aim. Pilots were told to dive at maximum speed, fire quickly, and escape before defensive gunners could react. But Parker's method didn't depend on reaction time alone. It depended on predicting future position, and faster targets simply required longer lead distances. Experienced gunners adapted quickly. They aimed farther ahead. The bullets still arrived at exactly the right point in space. Japanese tacticians tried coordinated attacks next, multiple fighters approaching from different directions at the same time. The idea was to overwhelm defensive gunners, force them to choose between targets, break their concentration, but again, the results weren't what they expected. Parker's technique didn't require complex calculations. It relied on visual estimation and instinct. A skilled gunner could switch targets in less than a second, estimate a new lead point. Fire A. Multiple attackers didn't reduce opportunities, they created more. Because every attacking fighter had to fly through predictable attack paths that could be anticipated, paths that eventually crossed the streams of .50 caliber bullets waiting ahead of them. By the summer of 1944, Japanese fighter losses to American rear gunners had increased dramatically. Some intelligence estimates suggested losses had risen by nearly 300% compared to the previous year. American bomber formations that once suffered heavy casualties were suddenly surviving missions with far fewer losses. Part of that improvement came from better escort fighters. Aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat and improved versions of the Corsair had begun dominating aerial combat. Another factor was declining Japanese pilot quality. Experienced aviators had been lost faster than they could be replaced, but an equally important factor sat behind the machine guns of American aircraft. Men who had quietly abandoned official doctrine, men who had learned to trust a mechanic's discovery made high above Rabaul Harbor. The technique continued spreading. Gunners who mastered it taught new recruits arriving from the United States. They explained it in ready rooms and briefing tents. They demonstrated it during training flights. By late 1944, the method had become almost universal among experienced air gunners, but still unofficial, still absent from the manuals, still technically unauthorized, and yet impossible to ignore. Because the results spoke louder than any regulation. The transformation could be seen clearly in squadron statistics. Units that once struggled to defend themselves were now shooting down enemy fighters regularly. Kill ratios improved, aircraft losses decreased. Confidence among bomber crews increased dramatically. Pilots who once dreaded Japanese fighter attacks now knew they had a better chance of surviving them. Meanwhile, Richard Parker continued flying missions. He wasn't thinking about theories or tactics, he was thinking about survival. Each flight meant more enemy aircraft, more split-second decisions, more moments where predicting the future meant the difference between life and death. His reputation inside the carrier group continued growing. Other gunners sought him out for advice. They wanted to know how to judge lead distances, how to read an attacking fighter's intentions, how to anticipate a maneuver before it happened. Parker explained the basics whenever he could. You can't just memorize numbers, he told them. You have to watch the airplane. He described how experienced gunners learned to read subtle signals, the angle of a dive, the shape of a turn, the way a pilot adjusted throttle during an attack. Each movement hinted at what would happen next. And if you could predict that next movement, you could place your bullets exactly where the enemy aircraft would fly. Idea sounded simple, but mastering it required experience, hours of combat observation, mistakes, misses, lessons learned the hard way. By the end of 1944, Parker had flown more than 30 combat missions. His personal tally of destroyed aircraft continued growing. Each victory reinforced the same principle. Bullets didn't hit targets where they were, they hit them where they would be. As the war continued into its final year, the technique Parker helped spread became one of many small advantages, pushing the balance of power toward the Allies. Individually, the improvement might seem minor, just a different way of aiming, but multiplied across thousands of engagements, across hundreds of aircraft, across entire bomber formations, the effect was enormous. A subtle shift in understanding had changed the outcome of countless aerial battles. And it had started with a single gunner looking at empty sky and trusting that the enemy would eventually fly into it. By the final year of the war in the Pacific, the change in aerial combat had become impossible to ignore. American bomber formations that once struggled to survive Japanese fighter attacks were now completing missions with far fewer losses. Enemy fighters still attacked aggressively, but the balance had shifted. Where Japanese pilots once relied on speed and maneuverability to evade defensive fire, they were now flying into streams of bullets placed exactly where their aircraft would appear seconds later. For American gunners, the principle had become second nature. They didn't think about manuals anymore, didn't calculate complicated formulas in the middle of combat. They simply watched the enemy aircraft and asked themselves one question: where will it be when my bullets arrive?
Richard Parker continued flying combat missions throughout 1944 and into early 1945. By then, his reputation had spread well beyond his original squadron. New gunners arriving from the United States often heard about him before they even reached the carrier. They had been told about the mechanic who had figured out how to hit Japanese fighters. The man who aimed at empty sky and somehow destroyed enemy aircraft with astonishing consistency. But Parker never thought of himself as an inventor. He was simply a gunner trying to survive the war. Each mission still carried the same risks. Each encounter with enemy fighters still demanded instant decisions. Sometimes his predictions were wrong. Sometimes the enemy maneuvered in ways that even experience couldn't anticipate. But more often than before, the bullets met their targets. And every successful engagement reinforced the same lesson. Understanding movement in time and space mattered more than following rigid instructions. By early 1945, Parker had flown 43 combat missions. His official record listed 17 confirmed kills and 9 probable victories against Japanese aircraft. For a rear gunner, those numbers were extraordinary. Most gunners completed entire tours without ever recording a single confirmed kill, but Parker's achievement wasn't just about personal victories. The method he helped spread had been adopted by hundreds of other gunners. Every time one of them placed a burst of machine gun fire ahead of an attacking fighter and watched it fly into the bullets, the idea Parker had discovered was proving itself again and again. Yet, throughout the war, the technique remained largely unofficial. Navy training manuals still described traditional deflection shooting. Doctrine changed slowly. Military institutions preferred established systems, even when battlefield experience suggested something better. It wasn't until after the war ended that analysts began examining the data carefully. In 1946, the United States Navy conducted a comprehensive study of aerial gunnery performance during the Pacific Campaign. They reviewed combat reports from dozens of squadrons. They compared engagement statistics. They interviewed pilots and gunners who had fought in hundreds of air battles. The results were striking. Squadrons that had adopted what researchers called extreme lead deflection techniques achieved dramatically higher hit rates than those relying strictly on the official doctrine. In some cases, the difference approached 3 times greater effectiveness. Investigators noticed something else as well. The technique had not originated from formal research laboratories or training centers. It had appeared first in combat units, spread informally between experienced gunners, shared through conversations in ready rooms and briefing tents. Taught through demonstrations rather than textbooks, it was a field innovation. A solution discovered under the pressure of real combat rather than theoretical analysis. When the Navy revised its gunnery training programs after the war, those lessons quietly found their way into the new manuals. Instructors began teaching larger lead angles. Training films demonstrated aiming far ahead of maneuvering targets. The concept was given a more formal name: dynamic deflection shooting. The manuals did not mention Richard Parker. They simply described the physics of bullet travel time and target movement. But anyone who had served as a gunner in the Pacific recognized the principle immediately. It was the same idea Parker had demonstrated years earlier above Rabaul Harbor. The technique didn't disappear with the end of World War II. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, American aircraft once again faced fast, maneuvering enemy fighters. This time the opponent was the Soviet-designed MiG-15, a jet aircraft far faster than the propeller-driven fighters of the previous war. The speeds involved were dramatically higher. Closing velocities sometimes exceeded 600 miles per hour, which meant bullets required even greater lead distances to intercept their targets. Gunners who understood the principles adapted quickly. Instead of aiming 8 or 10 aircraft lengths ahead, they sometimes aimed 15 or 20 lengths forward. The math had changed. The principle had not. Predict the future position. The bullet's there. The target would arrive shortly afterward. Later conflicts brought new variations of the same challenge. During the Vietnam War, helicopter door gunners faced fast-moving ground targets, trucks racing along jungle roads, motorcycles darting through supply routes. Once again, the same principle applied. If you fired at where the target currently was, you missed. If fired where it would be a second later, you hit. Even as technology advanced, the concept remained central to targeting moving objects. Modern aircraft eventually replaced human gunners with electronic systems, radar-guided weapons, computerized targeting, automatic lead calculations, but the computers were doing exactly what Parker had done mentally decades earlier, calculating where a moving object would be when a projectile arrived, and aiming there. The mathematics were identical. Only the speed of the calculations had changed. After the war, Richard Parker returned home to California. Like many veterans, he left the battlefield behind and tried to build a normal life. He settled in Sacramento, found work as an aviation mechanic, the same kind of technical work he had performed before the war interrupted everything. For more than 3 decades, he maintained aircraft engines for a regional airline. Passengers boarding those planes had no idea the quiet mechanic inspecting the had once helped reshape aerial combat. Parker married, raised 2 daughters, spent weekends fishing along the Sacramento River. Neighbors knew him as a friendly man who rarely talked about the past. When conversations occasionally drifted toward the war, Parker usually kept his story short. He spoke about the carrier, about the endless ocean patrols, about friends who never returned, but he almost never mentioned the shooting technique that had spread across the Pacific. To him, it wasn't a grand discovery, it had simply been common sense. Bullets took time to reach their targets, aircraft moved quickly, so you aimed ahead. That was all there was to it. Richard Parker died in 1991 at the age of 70. His obituary mentioned his service in the United States Navy. It mentioned that he had received the Distinguished Flying Cross for exceptional performance during combat operations. But like most wartime innovations discovered in the chaos of battle, the larger story remained largely unknown. Thousands of airmen had benefited from a simple realization made in a moment of desperation high above Rabaul Harbor. A gunner had looked at an approaching fighter and decided not to aim where the aircraft was. He aimed where it would be, and the enemy flew straight into his bullets. 17 confirmed kills, hundreds of gunners taught. Countless bomber crews who made it home because the fighters attacking them faced streams of bullets placed exactly where they would appear seconds later. All because one mechanic trusted observation more than doctrine. The principle he proved continues to shape how military forces think about engaging fast-moving targets even today. Not through complicated technology, not through secret weapons, but through a deeper understanding of how objects move through space and time. And sometimes the difference between missing and hitting comes down to a simple decision. Stop aiming at where the enemy is. Start aiming at where the enemy